make sure that that program doesn't contain controversial subjects, and you're not impolite to people.
No, definitely not, Dad. You know me. I'm never, ever controversial or impolite.
Yeah. Okay.
Welcome to Conversations with your lovable, never pisses anyone off, never been banned from Facebook or YouTube, never been sabotaged or censored for politely expressing a difference of opinion. Ex-Muslim host Aina, keeping it non-controversial. Welcome to episode 22. Today I will be speaking with the wonderful Irshad Manji, an inspiring Muslim reformer and founder of the Moral Courage Project and author of Controversial Stuff. I'll add links to her books in the show notes so you can check them out. Hi, Irshad.
Hi, how you doing?
I am so good and so happy to be speaking with you finally.
We've been planning this for a while, haven't we?
Yeah, and you've been an inspiration to me, let me just say, because I used to watch you when I was in university on City TV and be like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. There's like a South Asian-y person that talks about this stuff.
And what stuff in particular are you referring to? Because believe it or not, I actually did business news at the same time as hosting queer television.
Oh, really? No, I wasn't watching your business news.
I didn't think so.
But yeah, I was really happy to see someone from kind of my background. I know we don't have the exact same background.
Oh, yeah, but we're brown chicks.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, addressing more controversial issues that come up in our cultures and stuff. So I watched you on Queer TV, which was so exciting.
Thank you. And those were very exciting times. And then, the station that you just mentioned, City TV, went corporate. Mm-hmm. And I decided that I needed to be doing something else. Mm-hmm. And so here we are.
And so now you've left us in Canada and moved off to the U.S.
Oh, you know what? I'll never, ever leave Canada. Yes, I've moved to the United States, but I will always remain, a Canadian, not just in heart, but also in passport.
That's good to hear. Some of your reform stuff has been also very interesting. I know we don't perfectly align on that, obviously, because I'm a non-believer and you're a believer. So obviously there's some pretty basic differences in our views. But I think that I really support your work and work like yours because I think it's so necessary, right?
Well, I have to say that, okay, sure, while we might disagree, and we do disagree on something fundamental, and we can discuss that, of course, nonetheless, the fact that you are so open to my belief in God and in the basics of Islam really is reciprocated by me towards you. I completely defend and appreciate your right not to believe. And, to the degree that I can even metaphorically stand by you and our brothers and sisters who are fighting for the freedom to disbelieve, please know that I do stand shoulder to shoulder.
Thank you so much. It's so good to hear that because there's a kind of a degree of untouchability that comes with being ex-Muslim.
Yeah.
And I've spoken with other reformist Muslims and they really kind of don't want to have much to do with me simply because I'm a non-believer. So,
but what's their problem? Why do they say that, I can't associate myself with you and yet still be for reform? Like, do you get where they're coming from? Because at this moment, I don't.
I absolutely don't. And I'm always fighting for, the rights of people, especially even for Muslims, right? I'm like, don't generalize Muslims.
Absolutely.
And then when Muslims come along and say it's okay to generalize ex-Muslims, it's a bit inconsistent and also hurtful.
Well, I think you're being very charitable when you say inconsistent. I'm just going to call it what it is, and that's hypocrisy.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah. I suspect, by the way, that many reform-minded Muslims would not want to be associated with ex-Muslims simply because they're thinking about the politics of it all. But, I learned something early on in my journey as a reformist Muslim. I remember being told by many supporters, Irshad, if only you weren't gay, then it would be perfect. And I said to them, the problem is, though, that you're suggesting that I would want to have a constituency of supporters who are homophobic.
Yeah.
I don't.
Exactly.
And if the only thing that stops a potentially reformist Muslim from allying with me is my sexual orientation, then guess what? They're actually not reformists.
And not very good allies.
And not very good allies.
Yeah. Similar with the ex-Muslim thing. If you're, if you dislike non-believers, then you're not a very good reformist or an ally.
Exactly right. So,
Yeah.
I don't frankly lose much thought over this. Those who, do support where me and you are coming from should have the courage to say so. Doesn't mean they have to agree with everything. God knows even we don't.
Yeah.
But if you're going to, have integrity, and I do mean that very, very intentionally, integrity in advancing reform within Islam, then at the very least, have the wholeness and sincerity to develop your own backbone before asking the same of others.
Absolutely. Yeah, and congrats on getting married, by the way. Speaking of
Thank you.
people who are homophobic, and I think, I saw clips from your wedding video, and I saw your mom reading verses from the Quran.
To bless the marriage.
Which is pretty cool. I mean, again, I'm going to say that I don't understand how you can reconcile being gay and Muslim, but I will also say power to you. If you can shape your faith to fit you rather than try to shape yourself to fit a faith that doesn't necessarily work today, I'm going to support you in that 100%. And if your mom wants to, find verses from the Quran that she thinks works here and bless it, then power to you guys. I think that's so, so cool.
Well, and it's all in the interpretation. I don't for a minute claim that the Quran itself is consistent, let alone that it supports gay and lesbian people. But what I do say is that there are a number of verses in the Quran that ask us to think and analyze and reflect and rethink. And that's not to say that when you do that, you will come to the same conclusion as me. No. What I think is going on here is that faith cannot be sincere unless you yourself are critically examining it. If you're simply swallowing what other people tell you is the case, then you can call it what you want, but faith, as in trust, is not trust with God. That is not with God's self-appointed ambassadors. Call it what you want, but it is not faith, and certainly it's not sincere. And I think that for any a creator to be worthy of my worship, that creator has to be willing to engage in honest conversation with me and to not, shrink from questions. Otherwise, it's a petty God. And I'm not interested in worshiping a petty God. I'm interested in worshiping a majestic one.
Yeah, I think I was there. At one point in my life, I think I thought a lot along the same lines. So, for me, like going clubbing, dancing, whatever, were like spiritual experiences. And people, and my more religious relatives would be like, that's ridiculous, Right,
that's haram.
Yeah, so I never prayed. Even, when I did believe, I didn't really pray because I believed less in the ritual and more in the essence. So,
I get that.
So yeah, I think I was there at one point. It's just that the whole worshiping thing to me seems a bit petty. in itself. So, and I don't really get answers, and just the
Right.
one-way discussion, and there's so many contradictory things. It didn't work for me, and if it works for some people and you can use that in a positive way, then why not, right?
Well, and I'll also clarify that certainly the worshiping, if that means blind blind submission or blind obedience, that doesn't work for me either. Somebody recently confronted me in a loving way, but nonetheless confronted me to say, what is your ultimate loyalty? Is it what you call God, or is it freedom of inquiry? And given that crude choice, I was very upfront. I said, it's freedom of inquiry. But I reminded him, understand that in practicing my interpretation of Islam, I have not compromised freedom of inquiry at all. Quite the opposite. The deeper I go to ask the questions I have, the deeper my faith becomes. And that's not to say, again, that it's, quote, rational. I think that faith and rationality are two different realms. And to judge either by the other's, strong points, is to set yourself up for disappointment one way or the other. I'm sort of an and both kind of gal, not an either or one. And of course, I'm not a relativist. I don't believe that anything goes. I, sincerely denounce and fight against jihadism, as I do white supremacy.
Right.
There has to be standards of dignity and decency, not just for all human beings, but I believe for all creatures, animals included. So I do draw the line at certain points, but I also hope anyway that I conduct myself in a way that's humble enough and in wonder of the world enough to be open to hearing different points of view and considering them, rather than, simply shutting myself off from that with which I don't agree.
Right. I think being open to hearing different points of view can only strengthen your own or expand your mind. It's just a win-win, right?
Well, I think so. And, I'll go a step further. I realize that some people listening to this podcast would say, well, I don't see how it strengthens your own. And in any event, mine is already strong, so I don't need to hear opposing points of view. Well, here's something to think about. When you open yourself up to opposing points of view, and assuming that you want to have influence on the person who is opposed to your point of view, at the very least, you're going to hear what they're not hearing about your argument. And you'll then, want to consider, what is it that I can do to strengthen the way I communicate my argument? Because if that person is missing what I'm trying to say, the onus is not on them to agree or even respect your point of view. The onus is on you to clarify and frame it.
Deliberately don't understand. Like, they know what you're saying, but they just refuse to acknowledge it. That's a different thing entirely.
That's a different thing. And of course, you got to get good, right? If you want to have influence, you got to get good at sizing people up.
Right.
But rather than assuming that this person is, shall I say, irredeemable, I'm going to give that person a fair hearing, if only so that I can become a better messenger of my point of view.
Yeah. So this faith,
and if you're reaching a dead end, then you're reaching a dead end, but don't call it prematurely.
Yeah, you got to give it a chance. I mean, I get into these discussions with my family sometimes, and they're, they're lovely, very liberal Muslims, but in a way, I find that incredibly frustrating also.
Why is that?
Because it's like, there's so much whataboutery, right? Like, it's almost easier talking to an extremist because they're not playing these kind of mental gymnastics. And the people I love the most in the world are what I consider to be an oxymoron, right? Liberal theists. So we get into these discussions.
But can I ask you though? Can I ask you though, what, and again, I ask because I want to understand, what is contradictory about being a liberal theist?
Well, if you just look at the scriptures, right, there's some really violent, sexist, misogynistic, homophobic verses, and it's not just limited to Islam.
Of course.
So I understand the desire to just pick out the good bits, and I support that. But there's also the plausibility of the more awful interpretations, which I don't think should be denied, right? And people often fall into the game of denying it or sanitizing it. And I think that comes off really unfair, especially to people who have been victimized by religion. Exactly.
Yeah. So, no, I get that completely. And I think, again, I speak from years and years of, engaging with what I would call mealy-mouthed moderate Muslims, is that when they, sanitize the Quran, which is something, by the way, that I never try to do. Let me say up front, if I haven't already made it clear, that the Quran does contain regressive verses. No doubts about that. When, seemingly liberal Muslims sanitize that point, I think they're coming from a place of identity rather than faith. And what I mean by that is that, we all as human beings have egos, and we need egos in order to survive. But so many people who embrace any, ism or any dogma cling to their identities so tightly that they allow those identities to dictate to them. You must be X, Y, and Z. If you relent on any one of the things that your identity tells you you must be, then you're actually not that thing. You're not that identity. So, for example, if a Muslim acknowledges that, there are contradictions in the Quran, then, oh my God, I must not be a Muslim. What am I then? And, I would argue that the Quran itself, if you really take time to learn, acknowledges that there are inconsistencies. So instead of fearing those inconsistencies, use them to inform your own interpretation, and use them to be humble about that interpretation. I don't want to come off as, a hurler of this verse and that verse, but I must tell you that one of the most genius passages in the Quran says, and I'm quoting pretty much verbatim, that some of the passages in this book are precise, and other passages are ambiguous. And it is only those with disbelief in their hearts who will seize on the ambiguous passages and dictate the interpretations to other people.
Sure.
And this verse, I'll just finish up with this thought, and then the floor is yours. This verse ends by saying, believers, understand that only your Lord knows the full and final meanings of these passages. Which is why I, as a Muslim, have to have the humility to recognize that though I insist on my own interpretation, I cannot impose that on others. And by the way, this means, according to my interpretation, that neither can jihadis and other extremists.
They do, though.
They do, exactly. Exactly right, which is all the more reason that I take the stand for reform rather than simply, say, well, that's their interpretation. No, I'm sorry. So, the reason I oppose their interpretation is that they are imposing it on others.
Right, and I stand with you on that. But when you say, some passages are vague, and they say that they're that some passages are going to be vague, and we can just leave it at that, and then let God decide, which is a great interpretation. I wish everyone had that. But then there's also other passages which say that this is the literal word of God, and you have to take it seriously, and it's not vague. So,
right, yet another contradiction, for sure. Yeah. Right.
And then it says again, stuff about disbelievers that I can't.
Yes, it does.
It does. That I can't. That
you can't just turn your back on and presume that or neglect, right?
Right. And so when people say to me, it doesn't say that, you're just misunderstanding. It makes me very upset, because you're really just then denying something. That
exactly. That's the word, my friend, denial. And
Right.
this is why from a very, early stage after I wrote The Trouble with Islam Today, I pointed out that, to be in denial is in fact to raise suspicions
Exactly.
about what you're running away from. And if you think, moderate Muslims, that you're doing Islam any favors by wallowing in denial, you're going to find out sooner than later that in fact will only deepen people's suspicions of Islam.
I don't understand the motivation behind the denial and the rush to disassociate from Islam any terrorist attack, because what will that accomplish? Everyone can see.
Here's the thing. I understand it, but I don't accept it. And what I understand, as I said earlier, these people are coming from a place of identity. Identity, and I know that we, joked about being fellow brown chicks, but, I'm not going to speak for you at all. I certainly don't identify as just a brown chick. We are all many things at once. And so when anybody comes from a place of hardcore identity, as in I am Muslim, or I am a socialist, or I am a feminist, or I am a person of color, or I am a capitalist, or I'm a white guy. All of that is fodder for defensiveness. When you hear something that remotely threatens, the baggage that goes with being one thing.
One thing, exactly.
Yeah. Then your defenses, emotional defenses, naturally rise. And that is when, you either run away from the challenge that has just confronted you, or you denounce it heatedly. And either way, right, you're in denial.
Yeah.
Right.
So can I ask, in terms of not sanitizing and then reforming, what do you say to people who say that reform and this kind of cherry picking is a type of sanitization?
Right. Well, first of all, I would say, and again, I'm being brutally honest here as I try to be in every conversation. Yep, I am cherry picking. You bet. However, I'm honest about that. Whereas the people who oppose my reformist point of view are also cherry picking, but they will not be honest about that. Why do I say they're cherry picking? Because, and just sort of springboarding off of my earlier point about the contradictions in the Quran, there are also plenty of passages that are pretty forward-looking. There are passages that, at the very least allow, if not encourage, people to ask questions. The Quran contains 3 times as many verses calling on us to do that than verses calling on us to blindly obey. 3 times.
Yeah, I definitely agree that there's both types of passages, so you can pick your path.
Exactly. You can pick your path. And here's the thing. Why can't, and again, I'm asking a rhetorical question here because people are coming from a place of identity when they fail to do this. Why can't we own the fact that we are cherry picking and then explain why we are doing that? Why it is, something that is part and part of the spiritual journey. Right. So back to your question, when you said just now, what do you say to people who claim that you're cherry picking? I say, yes, I am. And frankly, the Quran is so at war with itself that we believers have but to choose about what to play up and what to downplay. Selectiveness is inevitable. And I choose to make the case for the possibility of a reformist interpretation of the Quran.
I mean, I think that honesty really helps further things along, right? It's the dishonesty that then gets everyone entangled in this conversation of, yes, you are, no, I'm not, yes, you are, no, I'm not, yes, it does, yes, it is inconsistent, no, it isn't. So just being honest about it and upfront about it helps you skip a few steps and move forward. So I think that's very helpful. But in terms of only picking the good parts, is that not a type of...
Acknowledging the regressive parts, but yes, emphasizing the good parts.
Emphasizing the good parts. Is that not a type of sanitization, or...
I don't think so. And not if what you mean by sanitization is, again, ignoring the lousy stuff. Mm-hmm. Again, I want to make very clear to our listeners today, I am not ignoring, denying, or whitewashing away the negative stuff. Mm-hmm. It exists, no question about that. But in focusing only on the negative stuff, we run the risk, and I think the very reality of ignoring the positive stuff. And so I wouldn't want to make that mistake only in the opposite direction. Do you see my point?
Yeah, no, I get it. I mean, I have heard some good stories from the Hadith and stuff in my childhood, like about giving kittens milk, or, I think there was one about a sex worker who went to heaven, and a guy who prayed 5 times a day but kicked a dog who ended up going to hell. So I remember hearing stories like that that my parents used to tell me to demonstrate that, only God can judge, and you don't go by these simplistic Wahhabi rules that you see around you, because we grew up in Saudi Arabia. I did. And my parents...
My condolences.
Yeah. Actually, it's made me who I am today, so I don't think I'd trade that experience. It was a fascinating experience.
Good for you.
Especially in retrospect. But like, my dad was always very wary about the Wahhabi Islam, and he was not on board with that at all. So he's been a very good secular role model for me all along. Even though I was raised in Saudi, even though he's a practicing Muslim, he was just very, very in tune with not kind of getting on board with the things that were around us all the time. And we saw a lot of our fellow Pakistani community members fall into that and get more and more religious and start donning the headscarf. And my dad was always like very vocally against it. So
that takes a lot of strength, particularly in an environment like that.
Yeah, it does. And he would talk about the pressure too at work, like how the Saudi people in the office would pressure the non-Saudis to go to mosque all the time for prayers, and my dad would just get really annoyed because he didn't like pray all the time. Like, I think he just prayed on Fridays or whatever. Right. So this made it obligatory and annoying for him. So anyways, let me just say that the idea of picking a good path and learning some positive lessons from the Quran. That does exist, and I have seen living examples of it. So why not pick that path? Absolutely. As long as we don't deny the more violent and dangerous and misogynistic parts of it. So I don't get this, but the real Islam isn't sexist, but the real Islam doesn't call for gender segregation. Right. Or actually, I wanted to ask you about a quote I heard from you about the raisins thing. So,
well, you want to explain to our listeners what my general argument was, and I'll definitely flesh it out.
Okay, so this is what I understood, is that there's no place, according to you in the Quran, that actually says there's virgins available for the martyrs in the afterlife, right? So Correct. It might be a mistranslation where they mean raisins.
Well, okay, so here's the deal. First of all, I am not claiming that I know the Quran so well that, I'm definitively saying that the word virgins has been mistranslated, that it really should have been raisins. What I am saying is that any one of your listeners who Googles virgins or raisins instantly will come up a couple of articles by 2 different scholars, one Muslim, or one ex-Muslim, I should say, one never has been Muslim, who make the case that the Quran is such a complex language that the word for virgins over, millennia has in fact been mistranslated. And what the original Quran said is that it is raisins that martyrs will get in heaven. And again, I appreciate that this is laughable to many of our listeners. But let's think about this in a historical context. In 7th century, what we now know as Saudi Arabia, there was absolutely no irrigation. There was, stark desert, and raisins, which come from grapes, would have been considered a delicacy. Something that's quite rare and that, really is a pricey treat. And so if, in fact, the Quran holds out any rewards for so-called martyrs, something like raisins would have not been a laughable reward. And again, it's not me who's saying this. It's a couple of scholars who have both reached that conclusion.
But then there's scholars, many, many, many scholars who have reached the other conclusion as well, right? And just looking at it in the context of the verses, like they talk about round breasts, big eyes, chaste, lowering their gazes and stuff like that. So that doesn't seem to fit with grapes.
Raisins.
Grapes or raisins.
But remember, we're at this moment talking about rewards for martyrs. And in the Quran, and you're right, it's according to me. But I lovingly challenge any of our listeners to go through the Quran and tell me where it tells us that so-called martyrs, people who kill themselves for a so-called higher cause, will in fact get a reward of virgins in heaven. Now, let me be clear. The Quran does describe virgins in heaven. And it talks about exactly the description that you've just given us. It does not, however, offer this to martyrs, or what we today would call martyrs. And just to push this point a little bit further, about 15 years ago now, I managed to cross into Gaza and interview the head of Islamic Jihad, obviously a known terrorist organization in the region. The political head, his name was Muhammad al-Hindi. I think he's still alive. And when I asked him, and this was my opening question, it remained the underlying theme of my interview with him. I asked him, since you endorse suicide missions and you say that Islam, it's Islamically informed, your point of view, tell me, sir, where in the Quran it says that you can kill yourself for a higher cause? He told me it's everywhere. And I said, great, then this will be easy. Give me one passage. Give me one verse. He tried looking for it. He couldn't come up with it. He consulted various books around him. He still didn't find it. He then tried to get out of the interview, telling me he's busy and he has to go. And I said, really? So you're telling me that when I go home and I look for this myself, it will be there? In other words, you're telling me that you're not lying to me. And he understood English very, very well, even though he spoke to me in Arabic. And, I understood all of this through a translator. He smirked like, oh, shit, I'm busted. And then he continued to look. And finally, he had to turn to a couple of his aides who, in turn, put a verse in front of me that had nothing to do with what I had asked about. Nothing. So, we have got, even those of us who fancy ourselves secular and rational and deep thinkers, we too have got to do our homework so as on blind faith what other secular, rational people with agendas have concluded on our behalf.
Like what?
Like, it's true that the Quran promises virgins in heaven to people who, go on suicide missions. Well, not only in my view and from my reading is that not true, but it is also not true that the Quran in any way endorses suicide missions.
Well, as we said, it's a very vague and contradictory book, so you can pick from it a message that you want. And if it's vaguely alluding to that kind of reward for people who die in battle for Allah, it can be concluded depending on what you're...
It can be stretched that way, for sure. But this is why I'm pointing out that unless you yourself, and I think you have, unless you yourself do the homework to read it, to think about it, to consult both supporting and opposing points of view, it would not be rational to simply accept, because other secular rational people say it's there, to simply accept that the Quran endorses suicide missions. I'm saying that it does not. Does that mean I'm telling you the full truth? No. I'm a human being, and that's how I see it. Sure. Because that's how the evidence has presented itself to me. But I mean, that does not make me an apologist for the violence in Islam. What it makes me is deeply skeptical of other people's agendas, no matter what the ideological point of view they're coming from.
And I think if people were more skeptical about listening to mullahs in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, then they could find a way where they would say that this doesn't fit with the modern way of living in the 21st century. And many Muslims have found that path. So that's great. But in terms of stretching it, I don't think it's really stretching it when the words are saying that in a battle, if you die for God, then there are rewards, right? It's just stretching it from maybe our perspectives because we're not in a battle or whatever. But if it's someone like ISIS, then they're perpetually in a battle with what they consider to be non-believers. And to them, non-believers are even majority Muslims who just don't practice the way they do. So for them, they can fit their worldview into everything that the Quran is saying. So for them, that raw material is there provided, right?
For sure. Which is reason alone that we can't deny the negative noise in the Quran.
Exactly. And so when you say that they're being offered raisins, or even if they are being offered raisins, and that in itself is problematic, that for something like there's still a reward, right? Even if it's
absolutely
raisins.
Yes. And this is where, again, from a rational point of view, I have to remember history, and I have to remember the 7th century fighting for a reward in heaven was not uncommon. In the 11th, 12th, 13th century, it was not uncommon. Again, we are all living in the 21st century, all that is, except for, people with a 7th century frame of mind. We are all living in the 21st century, and how we judge the diktats, the principles, the ideals of the 7th century will be from a contemporary point of view. And so while judge we must, in order to be ethical global citizens, we have to judge. Let us also keep in mind that it would be unfair, I think, to determine that, they were backward, when in fact, they were not backward for their time. They were absolutely in line for their time.
Yeah, but today that just doesn't work.
I get it.
Yeah,
I get it.
So what is it about Islam in particular that's kept it resistant, do you think, to secularization, to watering down, to kind of coexisting with modernity in the same way that Christianity has, or, other religions have to a greater degree?
Right. Well, first, you might remember, and perhaps your father, has already mentioned this and discussed it with you, that there was a time not so long ago, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, even early 70s, when, the restrictions on women, for example, were much fewer than they are today.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I mean, in Pakistan, in Egypt, in various other parts of the so-called Muslim world, women would be able to go out with their mini skirts.
My grandma has pictures that would be unbelievable today.
Unbelievable today. Exactly. And so while there are, and I'm happy to get into this in just a second, while there are, certain things about Islam that make it very challenging, to advocate reform, nonetheless, it is not immune to the kind of modernity that you and I are talking about. Precedents have been set. And this is where I now want to get into a direct answer to your question. In Egypt, for example, there was a very promising reform movement in the 1920s. And the reason it failed, by the way, it was led by feminists. Again, people whom you and I today would still call feminists. And it failed. Why did it fail? Well, the research I've done strongly suggests it failed because there was one trump card that anti-modernists were always able to pull out of their back pockets and exploit. And that is the trump card of Western colonialism. For example, the feminists who led the 1920s reform movement in Egypt were called, puppets of the West. And that almost instantly killed the credibility of their movement.
Now that's what they do to us, to Malala.
Exactly right. This is the ongoing issue from a practical point of view. This is the ongoing issue.
But it's also hypocritical because look at Saudi Arabia, Saudi colonialism, Saudi imperialism. What it's done to Pakistan is, it's horrific, right?
Horrific.
In my own lifetime, I've seen people's views and perspectives. I've seen the language evolve where they try to take the Persian words out of our greetings and they stick the Arabic words in. I've seen our wedding traditions change where people oppose really basic, simple, colorful wedding traditions and try to make them more like desert Arabian and bland.
Correct. Correct.
That's also imperialism, but that's not an imperialism.
That's exactly right.
That anybody opposes.
Right. Well, and particularly people who call themselves progressive.
Yes, and those who oppose this Western colonial thing, then they don't oppose consistently.
Exactly right. And so, the question then naturally becomes, okay, what do we do about that? Look, I don't have a bullet point or bulletproof answer. What I do think is necessary is for people like you and me, and you've certainly been doing your share with podcasts and, brilliant articles and so forth, we've got to keep getting the message out there for a new generation of Muslims that imperialism is imperialism is imperialism. And, as a 1960s feminist so beautifully put it, you can't dismantle the master's house by using the master's tools. Okay. So, you can't meet dogma with yet more dogma because guess what? It's still dogma. I think, it's incumbent upon people like you and me, and by that I mean people who believe that we're coming from a secular, rational point of view, to role model that rationality so wisely, so beautifully, that when we encounter and go out actually and engage with a new generation of Muslims, understanding where they're coming from and not just insisting that they understand where we're coming from, that when they think about that conversation in their more private moments, when they don't have to be, quote, on script, they will see that it is possible to be open-minded, to be questioning, and still have some kind of a respect for the traditions from which you came.
Yeah, but here's the thing. When we come out and we try this stuff, the Western left also tries to silence our voices in many times. So like in Ontario, our sex ed curriculum is very compatible with, my children's book, My Chacha is Gay, and they read it in school for their anti-homophobia day. And it was really, teachers liked it and everyone liked it until the message got back to Pakistani Muslim parents home, and then everybody was outraged. And what did the schools do? They did not stand up for me or say that we will continue to use this resource, which is good to teach kids from Pakistani households or Muslim households who actually really need to learn this message of diversity more than anyone. Instead, they yanked the book and didn't pursue using it ever again in any official capacity. Or when I wanted to speak out about the niqab stuff going on in Canada. There was a woman who refused to take off the face veil during the citizenship oath, and they were only hearing from people that were pro-face veil. And they bumped me off of a few panels, radio shows. So, I mean,
so what now, right?
What now? Yeah.
Okay, so I think, and this is something I'm doing in my next book, which I'm writing these days, I think we've got to seize upon that word diversity. You just mentioned it, and I think that's a hugely important word. And send the message that for diversity to be truly inclusive, it has to embrace diversity of thought. And what that means is that even within affinity groups like Muslim or gay or women or people of color, that decision makers such as teachers, such as corporate leaders, such as politicians, have got to ask within these affinity groups, what are the diverse points of view? And how can we bring that diversity out into the open? And I'll tell you, I've been testing this idea of challenging progressive people on their definition of diversity and their practice of it. I've been testing this out in various speeches that I've been giving over the last, I'd say, number of months.
Excellent.
And I must tell you that when it's framed this way, that folks, diversity of labels is not real diversity. Real diversity, inclusive diversity, must embrace diversity of thought. They stop in their tracks. Because here's the thing. We're not opposing the idea of diversity, okay? So what we're saying is, you want diversity? What you're practicing right now is superficial diversity. You want meaningful diversity? We got to dig deeper. And here's how we can do that.
Yeah.
So, right, we're not challenging this cultural, embrace of diversity, nor should we. Diversity is great. But let's not be narrow about it. Let's not be exclusive in the way we practice diversity. And it's interesting, even practitioners of diversity for school boards and whatnot, they realize, oh my God, I mean, the way I've been practicing diversity is a real, undermining of what I claim to stand for.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we can only keep trying and hope for the best. It's not looking good, but maybe this kind of flip of politics where Trump is in power and there's Nazis out and about will get people to listen more to other perspectives.
I have to say that, the reason I'm optimistic about, and again, maybe optimism is too strong a word. I'm hopeful. I can't legitimately say that I'm optimistic, but I can sincerely say that I'm hopeful. And the reason for my hope is that I am now engaging a new generation of Muslims, not just at universities, but in various other places. And I am seeing for the first time in the 15, 16 years that I have been publicly, advocating for reform in Islam, I am seeing a hunger and an openness for deeply honest conversations. Just not long ago, I headlined an event at the University of Southern California where I now teach. It was called Forbidden Questions About Islam. And it was an event in which I solicited the most politically incorrect questions about Islam that anybody has ever harbored. And this was their golden opportunity to express them and have them addressed.
That's great.
First of all, can I say that there were far more hijab-wearing Muslim girls in that audience than I ever imagined would come close to it. And second, they were the ones who 2 hours after the event was over were still congregating to ask more questions. And I didn't ask this at first because I didn't want them thinking that, I've got an agenda to get their support for my point of view. But I asked them towards the end of those 2 hours of conversation, did you like this event? Did you think it was worthwhile having? And almost to a person, they said, we need more of this.
That's great. That's really good to hear. If only more universities would host discussions like this.
Exactly. Using, the language of the left to challenge them to practice it more honestly.
Well, yeah, I mean, intersectionality should include the intersection of disbelief or questioning belief.
You bet.
But it doesn't, right? So,
well, not yet.
Not yet. Yeah.
But that's part of this uphill path. Is that we've got to have enough hope to continue not just advocating a deepening of diversity by including diversity of thought, but also, and this is really key to our own integrity and our own credibility, we've got to role model it.
Yeah, I think you're doing a good job.
Well, so are you.
On a much smaller scale.
No. But you see, here's the thing. By even engaging with me, a believer, and, not sort of sledgehammering me with atheist dogma. No, it's not atheism. It's atheist dogma, okay, that I have a real hard time with, because dogma is dogma is dogma.
I hear you. There are some really dogmatic atheists out there who...
Right. And by not sledgehammering me with that, you can see that I'm spending even more time with you on this podcast than I had initially planned for.
Amazing.
Why? Because I'm genuinely enjoying our conversation.
That's so great to hear.
Well, but yes, it is wonderful to hear. But here's my bigger point: is that you are role modeling the very openness that you are asking of others, and so you're showing me A, that it's possible, B, that it's coming from a deeply sincere place on your part. And see that if I'm going to have my own, kind of credibility with you, I need to reciprocate your openness. So ultimately, it is relationship by relationship by relationship. I'm sorry to say, there is no shortcut to any of this. Okay, but if we can see for ourselves that we've got to be the best billboards for what we are asking of others, then we're actually going to become better communicators of the need for asking more questions.
You've just got me like all red and blushing, so... Because you said so many nice things about me.
Well, and you know that I mean them. And, to kind of put a finishing flourish on where we started, I don't know if this is what you've observed, but certainly, as a brown chick, when I blush, I actually get browner.
Well, I actually just blush probably inside. You can't see me turn red. But.
Okay. But no, I'm so honored and so privileged to do this podcast with you. People like you, honestly, they fuel my hope, because I see that I'm not talking to a wall when I encourage openness. I've come up with this phrase, they're rare, but they're there. Meaning those people with integrity, they're few and far between. And by the way, they will always be few and far between, because wrestling with the ego is probably the hardest thing that we human beings need to do. It's hard, very hard. But if we can see to it that we loosen the grip on our own egos just enough to hear others, so that their emotional defenses come down just enough to hear us in turn, okay, we will have done such a great, and by the way, a service that only makes us, better human beings.
I mean, that's only the way to get your message across, is try not to make people defensive, right? At least that's what I believe in, and I do try for that.
Correct. And so here's, as a final thought, here's one thing that you might want to try with your family. You mentioned in this podcast that they so often come from a place of denial. And I added that I think that denial comes from defensiveness. You might want to say to them, guys, I'm not trying to win any debate here. Okay? If that's where you're coming from, I'm going to let you win. You win. I'm saying that right now. You win. Okay?
Oh, I never say that to them.
Okay. Well, but here's the thing. If they know that you're not there to play gotcha politics.
Yeah.
They just might. It's worth an experiment.
Yeah.
They might be willing to be more vulnerable with you. And you say, yeah, but Irshad, I can't say you win. That would compromise my integrity. I hear that. And so another thought would be to let them know, I'm honestly not trying to make you defensive.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
There's no need for defensiveness here. I'm not going to be defensive. You don't need to be either. Let's just be human with one another. Mm-hmm. See what comes of that.
I just want to make clear that we have very pleasant and nice discussions.
Yeah.
We're actually one of the few families that can openly discuss and debate religion from the Pakistani community that I've come across. Otherwise, there's a whole lot of silence and just obedience that I see. So I do really appreciate my family, and I think, they did raise me to be very very rule breaky and oppose everything, question everything.
I hope your father doesn't regret that, though.
I don't know. He just kind of shakes his head and smiles, right? He just explains it away. Oh yeah, you're an artist. That's how he explains it. So
in that case, leverage your artistry, my friend. Right? Maximize its impact. You know, which I see that you're already doing, and I want to use that call and your role modeling of that call to encourage our listeners, to be creative in how they advocate for a rational approach to life.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Irshad. I think it's been a very fruitful and productive and excellent discussion. I could talk to you for 7 more hours, but I don't think you have that kind of time.
At this moment, I don't. But hey, when the new book comes out, let's actually do another podcast. Okay?
Let's do it. Definitely. I'd be honored. Excellent.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for joining me today, Irshad, and good luck with your new book and all your upcoming projects. And I will be talking to you again, as we just said, right?
Love it. Power to the mangoes.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Polite Conversations. You can support this podcast by sharing the shit out of it, making some noise about it, or contributing via Patreon. Patreon.com/nice mangoes. No E in mangoes. Also, you can follow me on Twitter @nice mangoes. If you want to make a one-time donation instead of a monthly Patreon one, you can do so via PayPal. nicemangoes.blog@gmail.com. Remember, no E in mangoes. If you've got an interesting story and would potentially like to be a guest, you can email me there too. A special thanks to Dylan Beck for theme music, sound, and production help.